Long before oil-shaped empires and long before currencies defined global alliances, water determined everything: land value, agricultural power, political stability, and human survival itself. Here's what nobody tells you. Every major civilization that ever collapsed first stumbled when its water systems faltered. Ancient Mesopotamia, 2200 BCE. The Maya lowlands, around 900 CE. The Indus Valley, 1900 BCE. When the rivers shifted or the monsoon cycles broke, power followed. And now, for the first time in modern history, a similar pattern is re-emerging, but with a dangerous twist. This time, it's not only nations positioning themselves around water, it's corporations, investors, private funds, entities built not on territorial claims, but on profit structures. And here's where the pattern begins. In the early 2000s, analysts noted small but telling changes: farmland acquisitions in drought-prone regions, private utility takeovers, and multinational bottling companies securing long-term groundwater rights. At first, it looked like business, ordinary expansion, typical globalization. Then the bill arrived. Drought cycles intensified, infrastructure aged, populations grew, demand surged, and a resource that once felt infinite began revealing its limits. Today, water scarcity affects regions that never imagined themselves vulnerable: the American West, Southern Europe, parts of China. Even river basins once considered stable are entering volatility cycles. This brings us directly into the viewer's financial present. Because water is not simply a natural resource, it's embedded in every economic system: food prices, real estate, energy production, manufacturing, medical facilities. Every dollar, every industry, every household depends on a stable flow. Analysts now argue that the privatization wave may reshape markets in ways not seen since early oil consolidation. If corporations secure exclusive access or priority rights, then control over water becomes control over everything that requires water, which is, effectively, the entire world economy. But to understand why this is happening now, we must start with the roots. Deep historical roots that show how water has always been a geopolitical instrument long before modern companies entered the field. Take ancient Egypt, where the Nile's seasonal flooding determined grain output, tax revenue, and political legitimacy. Pharaohs did not rule merely by divine status, they ruled by water management. Whoever controlled irrigation canals controlled food, and whoever controlled food controlled power. Or consider the Persian Empire, which engineered the Qanat system, underground channels that transported mountain water across vast, dry regions. These infrastructures did more than irrigate fields. They established stable borders, enabled long-term settlement, and turned deserts into economic hubs. Fast forward to medieval Asia, where China's Grand Canal allowed the movement of rice, taxes, and troops. Water became the artery that kept the empire alive. Throughout history, water control didn't just support civilization, it defined it. Which raises a crucial modern question. If water has always been the substance that determines who thrives and who collapses, what happens when its control shifts from public institutions to private ownership? And if that shift accelerates, as analysts suggest it may, how does it change the future of national sovereignty? We will answer this in Section 2. But first, let me show you exactly how the cracks formed, how a resource once treated as a universal right became a global asset. The early cracks appeared quietly. In the 1990s, several countries, struggling with debt or pressured by international lenders, sold portions of their municipal water systems to private firms. The promise was modernization, efficiency, and clean delivery. At first, it looked like a miracle. Aging infrastructure was replaced, revenue stabilized, water loss in pipes decreased. But then the bill arrived. Rates rose, access fluctuated. and democratic control over a public good shifted toward tariff structures and shareholder priorities. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. Because privatization didn't stop with local utilities. It expanded. Corporations began purchasing groundwater rights beneath farmland. They acquired river-adjacent plots that allowed diversion permits. Bottling companies signed multi-decade extraction agreements. Investment funds, some backed by pension groups, others by multinational banks, started acquiring farmland not for crops, but for the water beneath it. Here's why this matters. Water beneath land is often governed by older legal frameworks. Frameworks written before climate shifts, before population surges, and before global speculation. And these frameworks, in many regions, allow private owners to extract water even when surrounding communities face shortages. This is where the pattern begins to reveal its geopolitical scale. In Australia, water rights were turned into tradable financial products, commodities in a market where prices spiked during drought years. Some economists argue that one scenario suggests this experiment foreshadows a future where water behaves like oil futures in the 1970s. In Chile, private groups acquired significant control over rivers and groundwater during the late 20th century, shaping irrigation access and hydropower distribution. Later reforms attempted to rebalance ownership, but the precedent had already been set. Water could be privately held. Across the United States, especially the Southwest, private firms acquired farmland along aquifers not primarily to farm, but to pump. In several cases, extraction exceeded recharge rates, accelerating local depletion. Counties noticed wells running dry, but legal options remained limited under existing water laws. And in South Asia, companies purchasing land in water-rich regions created new tensions as neighboring drought-prone areas suffered. At first glance, these events appear local, independent, coincidental. But analysts reviewing the global pattern argue that something larger is happening, a strategic consolidation of the world's most irreplaceable resource. Here's the mechanism. Water scarcity increases its economic value faster than almost any other commodity. Not speculation. Necessity. You can delay buying gas. You cannot delay drinking water. And when drought cycles intensify, as climate models suggest they may, control of water rights becomes leverage. Political, economic, social. Why now? Becomes the central question. Why would corporations accelerate their acquisition of water rights in the 2010s and 2020s? Analysts propose several converging factors. First, global demand is rising. By 2030, some estimates suggest that demand for water may exceed supply by as much as 40% in certain regions. That is not a shortage. That is structural scarcity. Second, climate volatility is altering river flows and precipitation cycles. Regions once predictable are now uncertain. Investors act when systems become unstable, and water is becoming unstable. Third, infrastructure decay is creating opportunity. Many nations lack the funds to modernize water systems, opening the door for private groups that can finance upgrades in exchange for long-term control. Fourth, agricultural consolidation incentivizes water acquisition. Large industrial farms require consistent supply, and owning rights ensures priority during shortages. Fifth, financialization has entered the picture. Water futures contracts debuted in the U.S. in 2020, signaling that markets now view water the way they view oil, gas, and agricultural commodities. Together, these forces create a landscape where corporations see water not just as a resource, but as the strategic asset of the century. Here's why this matters. When corporations buy rights, they buy influence. They gain the ability to determine who gets supply first, how much it costs, and when it flows. And, unlike oil or minerals, there is no substitute for water. Control of water is control of life. But the danger wasn't what people saw: corporate acquisitions, farmland sales, bottling operations. It was what they ignored: the shifting legal frameworks quietly redistributing access. In many regions, water laws were written under assumptions of abundance. Those assumptions are no longer reliable, and yet the legal structures remain. Everyone believed that public control was permanent. But no law is permanent, and rights, once transferred, rarely return without conflict. The early 2020s exposed the vulnerability. The Colorado River, serving 40 million people, entered crisis. Reservoirs hit record lows. States negotiated emergency reductions. Amid the chaos, analysts noticed something striking. Private entities with senior water rights faced fewer cuts than public users. A resource meant to sustain communities was now subject to decades-old contracts held by private groups. In Europe, droughts exposed hydropower instability. In India, groundwater over-extraction forced regions to truck water in. In South Africa, water shortages triggered national debates about privatization versus public investment. These events were not identical, but they echoed the same warning: water scarcity amplifies the power of those who own rights. Now we reach the cliffhanger, the question that determines the future of resource geopolitics. If water is becoming the world's most valuable asset, and corporations are acquiring rights at unprecedented speed, what happens when scarcity intensifies and nations must negotiate with private entities for their own supply? Section 2 will reveal the shifting power landscape that analysts suggest may define the next century, and the scenarios that could unfold if water ownership continues its current trajectory. The map of global power is changing, but not through armies, currencies, or oil fields. It is changing through rivers, aquifers, basins, and reservoirs. Analysts studying modern scarcity argue that the world is entering a new era of geopolitical negotiation where control over water, not just access to it, will shape alliances, markets, and even national strategies. And here's the mechanism: the more unpredictable water becomes, the more valuable ownership becomes. Not water itself: water rights, paper contracts, legal priority, control by signature rather than by sword. To understand the scale of this shift, we need to look carefully at what's happening right now, not as isolated events, but as interconnected signals of a global transition. Across North America, analysts note that private investment funds have begun acquiring agricultural land along major aquifers. At first, these purchases looked like attempts to profit from rising farmland prices. But deeper analysis revealed a pattern. Many acquisitions prioritized land with high groundwater access rather than land with crop potential. Water beneath soil is more valuable than the soil itself, and rights to that water, governed by a patchwork of state laws, grant extraordinary leverage during drought cycles. Across Europe, a different trend emerged. Privatized utilities, operating under decades-old contracts, faced public backlash as droughts worsened and infrastructure strains exposed weaknesses. Yet, even amid protest, companies retained their contractual authority. Analysts suggest one scenario where tightening water cycles may shift political power toward entities capable of financing large-scale modernization, entities that will likely demand long-term control in exchange for investment. Across Asia, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, corporations purchasing land in water-rich regions have contributed to new internal tensions. Farmers in neighboring drought-prone districts reported dropping groundwater levels as extraction increased in corporate-controlled areas. The conflict was not over land. It was over invisible flows beneath the land. Across Africa, foreign agricultural investors have secured long-term leases on fertile land bordering major rivers. These deals provide water rights, sometimes unlimited, to private companies, even during scarcity. Local populations often face restrictions on irrigation while exported crops receive priority access. The geopolitical consequence is subtle but profound. Sovereignty becomes complicated when a nation cannot fully control its most essential resource. At first glance, these developments seem independent, regional events shaped by local policy. But analysts reviewing global trajectories argue that these pieces form a much larger picture, a worldwide transition of water from public good to strategic asset, and the consequences will ripple across the next century. Here's what nobody tells you. Water privatization is not merely an economic event, it is a geopolitical shift, a transfer of power from states to corporations, a redefinition of sovereignty. To see how this plays out, we must examine the mechanisms that transform water into leverage. The first mechanism is priority of access. Water rights often specify who receives water first, second, and third during shortages. During normal years, these priorities seem inconsequential. But when rivers shrink or reservoirs fall, priority determines survival. A senior water rights holder may continue extracting even as downstream communities face severe cuts. And if the rights holder is a corporation, the government must negotiate, not command. The second mechanism is price influence. Water pricing is typically set by public regulators. But in regions where utilities are privatized, companies can influence rate structures. Analysts suggest one scenario where rising scarcity may lead to dramatic increases in price tiers, affecting households, farmers, and industries differently. Water becomes an economic sorting mechanism. Those who can pay adapt, those who cannot face restrictions. The third mechanism is resource arbitration. When water rights conflict between farms, cities, industries, or private companies, legal battles determine outcomes. Corporations with legal teams and financial backing often prevail over smaller stakeholders. Control shifts not through physical possession, but through legal endurance. The fourth mechanism is cross-sector influence. Companies that own water rights gain leverage over agriculture, energy, manufacturing, and real estate. A corporation controlling irrigation access can influence crop output. A corporation controlling reservoir output can influence electricity supply. A corporation controlling municipal networks can influence urban growth. Here's the trap. When water becomes a strategic asset, those who control it gain power far beyond the water sector. But to fully grasp the future, we need to examine three possible scenarios analysts outline for the decades ahead, each shaped by how nations respond to corporate expansion and water volatility. Scenario 1. Cooperative governance. In this scenario, governments, corporations, and local communities develop shared frameworks that balance profit, access, and environmental sustainability. Nations implement strict limits on extraction, and corporate ownership remains but is regulated tightly. Water markets exist but function transparently. Analysts argue this is possible if states recognize early that water will define national stability and act before scarcity becomes severe. Scenario 2. Consolidated control. Here, corporations continue acquiring rights faster than governments adapt. As scarcity intensifies, companies with senior rights gain disproportionate influence over food production, urban development, and industrial growth. Nations become increasingly dependent on private entities to secure supply. Some analysts suggest this could resemble early oil monopolies, where a handful of players shaped global power for decades. Scenario 3. Tension and conflict. This is not presented as inevitable, but as a scenario. If scarcity worsens faster than governance reforms, conflicts may emerge. Not necessarily between nations, but between public institutions and private rights holders. Cities versus utilities. Farmers versus agribusiness. Communities versus extraction companies. Water stress becomes social stress, and social stress can become political. The lines between public need and private entitlement blur. These scenarios are not predictions. They are frameworks. ways of understanding how the next century might unfold depending on choices made now. To see why this is more than theory, consider the power dynamics forming in real time. In the Middle East, nations like Saudi Arabia are investing in foreign farmland to secure water-intensive crops they can no longer grow domestically. This strategy shifts water demand abroad, exporting stress to other regions. In China, large-scale water transfer projects reflect internal scarcity that analysts argue may shape future geopolitical decisions. In South America, disputes over river access and the role of private companies in those basins are intensifying as hydropower and agriculture compete for supply. Each region reveals a different side of the same truth. Water scarcity reshapes power structures, and ownership reshapes scarcity. But here's what nobody tells you. Scarcity does not simply reveal power, it creates it. When water becomes unpredictable, those who offer predictability, whether governments or corporations, gain influence. When infrastructure fails, those who rebuild it gain leverage. When rivers dry, those who control groundwater gain authority. This is why corporations are buying water rights now. Not because water is valuable today, but because it may become priceless tomorrow. To understand who benefits and who pays, we must look deeper. Multinational bottling companies gain access to low-cost extraction rights that allow them to operate through droughts. Agricultural conglomerates secure water for high-value crops even when local farmers face restrictions. Private equity firms acquire land not for farming, but for the hidden asset beneath, the aquifer. Utility corporations negotiate long-term contracts that guarantee revenue regardless of local conditions. And who pays? Communities that rely on shallow wells, farmers with junior rights, cities with aging infrastructure, nations with inconsistent rainfall, households whose water bills rise as scarcity increases. Small industries that cannot compete with large-scale users. Here's why this matters. Water privatization creates a tiered system of access, where priority is determined by contracts rather than need. And when scarcity grows, those tiers widen. But the future is not fixed. Some nations are rethinking privatization. Some are reclaiming water systems. Others are rewriting extraction laws, restricting corporate purchase of rights, or prioritizing environmental flows. These efforts may shape the balance of power in the decades ahead. Yet analysts warn that even with reform, the underlying challenge remains. Water is becoming volatile. And volatility makes every decision, public or private, carry higher risk. As we reach the close of this documentary, the central truth becomes unavoidable. Water is not just another resource. It is the core infrastructure of civilization, and when corporations buy water rights, they buy influence over the systems that depend on it: food, energy, wealth, sovereignty. The world is entering a century defined not by who controls oil, but by who controls rivers, aquifers, and rainfall patterns. And the decisions made today, quietly, contract by contract, will determine whether water becomes a shared resource or a private empire. The question that remains is not whether scarcity is coming. Analysts already suggest its early signs are everywhere. The question is who will own the future when the wells run low.